How's it going, everyone? I hope you're doing well. So in the world of Christian relationships, between sermons and podcasts and YouTube videos and books, there's a lot of information being thrown around as far as who to date, when to date, what to date, the do's and do nots of dating, and it can all be very overwhelming. Sometimes information from two different sources is contradictory, and it can be difficult to know what to believe or which direction to sort of turn your dating life. So in an effort to streamline the flow of information and help you pick out the book that will best fit your needs, I read 5 books on Christian dating and singleness, and I'm here to share with you what those books say. Hopefully by the end of this video, one of them will sound appealing to you and you'll be willing to give it a read. So the first book I read was Single, Dating, Engaged, Married by Ben Stuart. Just to show my cards right off the bat, this is the best book out of all 5 that I read. I've actually read this one once before a few years ago. So the book itself is actually based on a sermon series that Ben did back in like 2016 or 2017 by the same name. Pretty sure you can find it on YouTube or podcast apps, but the sermon series was really good. And then what he did was he just put it in book form. He added some layers to it as well. Stuart is just a master of using illustrations to drive home points, like both in his sermons and in the book. He just has a story or like a movie reference or just an anecdote that relates back to whatever point he's making, and they're like funny and they're like tug at the heartstrings. That's the way that I retain information is through illustrations. So Stuart is amazing about that. The biggest takeaway from this book that I got as far as like dating goes is Stuart's very easy to remember 2 criteria to look for when trying to find someone to date or eventually marry. 1, character. They need to be pursuing God. They need to show wisdom that comes from being in a relationship with God and everything. And then 2, they need, or the 2 of you need, chemistry. And he specified that as like theological chemistry, your theological beliefs, social chemistry, do you get along, vocational or occupational chemistry, do you guys have similar goals in life, and then physical chemistry, are you attracted to each other? In a world where you feel like you need to have a checklist and every box needs to be checked before you can date or marry a person and all these things, Stuart really simplifies the process, or simplifies how we should view the process. And I just think that's really helpful. Last thing about this book is for every stage, for whether you're single, dating, engaged, or married, he provides a case study, a biblical case study of a character in the Bible who was in that stage of a relationship. So for singleness, he wrote about Paul, and it's not just like he wrote vaguely about Paul or the fact that Paul was single, but he like took a very specific passage in 1st or 2nd Timothy, and he just broke down like 8 points from this very narrow passage on how Paul modeled godliness in his singleness, and he does that for every stage. So when it's tempting to feel like the Bible is irrelevant, especially in like the world of relationships, Stuart expertly brings it back around, so like shows how it is still very relevant for us today. How the characters in the Bible were real people, and they went through, relatively speaking, not dating or engagement necessarily, but they went through the same processes that we go through today. And it's so good. If you only read 1 book off this list, I would recommend that you read this one. But also, like I said, if you don't feel like reading the book, the podcast or the sermon series that the book is based on, it's on the internet somewhere. So if you're more inclined to listen, a lot of the same information is on that, and I would recommend reading that or listening to that as well. 10 out of 10 book. Highly recommend. The next book I read was Outdated by Jonathan J.P. Pokluda. This book is a lot different than Single, Dating, Engaged, Married. JP's objective with this book was to confront 11 or 12 different dating myths that exist in our culture today. Stuff like, falling in love at first sight, I have to cohabitate with my boyfriend or girlfriend before I can get married to them. We need to have sex before we get married to know if we're compatible. All these different myths that, are pretty commonly held beliefs in our culture today, especially among people who aren't Christians. Every chapter he addresses one of those myths and replaces it with a biblical truth, which is really good. JP was definitely the man to write a book like this because he's very confrontational with his words. He's pretty bold and he's pretty unapologetic in his wording. He knows what the truth of the Bible is, and he doesn't really give any sort of ground to anyone else in that sense, which is good. I could see some readers being put off by how bold he is with his words, but I think it's important, and I think that in a sense, if you or someone you know holds to a lot of the beliefs that he addresses, that this would be a good book for them to read. Of the 5 books I read, this would be the one I would recommend to someone who is not a Christian, or if you have a friend who's not a Christian and you want to recommend a book on relationships to them, I would recommend this one. I think it came out this year in 2021, so it's just very recent, but it just reads as if like JP is having a debate. In contrast to Ben Stewart's character and chemistry being the 2 things to look for when looking for someone to date, JP's approach is much more stripped down even. He says, "Here's what you do. This is probably my single best piece of dating advice, so grab your highlighter. Here it comes. If you're a man, think of the godliest single woman you know and ask her out on a date. That's it." So for JP, chemistry is more of a non-factor as far as getting the ball rolling in a relationship. Like, straight up, don't look for chemistry at all, in a sense. Just look for character, look for godliness, and then ask that person out. It does, again, further simplify sort of the process and like all the questions running through someone's mind when they're looking for someone to date. He makes it very simple as part of his, again, sort of bold, unapologetic confrontation to myths. He takes out all of the filler and just bare bone, this is what you do, this is what you should do. So I don't personally agree with everything in this book, but it is still a good book. Again, it's one that I would recommend to someone who holds a lot of the beliefs, the myths that he addresses. It's definitely worth your time if you pick it up. It's not too long, and I think I would recommend it to Christians and non-Christians alike. The next book I read after that was The Sacred Search by Gary Thomas. I like this book because 1, the chapters are short, so it doesn't feel like it took super long to get through, and 2, Thomas just writes like a fun uncle or something, in my opinion. Like he just writes very conversationally. He has like sort of dad sense of humor that sort of makes you roll your eyes, but you can appreciate. The book itself is less about who to date, like in the other 2 books that I've talked about. This book has more to do with things to consider before marriage while you are dating someone. So it's still applicable to single people, but it's more geared towards people who are already in a dating relationship, and I think the book is meant to be read like together. So you sort of go through this list of things to consider before marrying, goals in life, your significant others, parents, your own parents who will eventually one day be the grandparents of your children, character qualities to look for in each other. The book assumes a few things like that you are familiar with the biblical advice to like not be unequally yoked sort of thing, and it sort of goes beyond that into the weeds a little bit of what being equally yoked actually means, or like the specifics of that. My favorite chapter in the book, and I think the chapter that makes the book worth reading, or like if you were only to read one chapter out of the book, it would be this one, would be the chapter called What's Your Style? The whole chapter, he just presents like 15 different marriage styles, some that are, factually unhealthy, some that are factually biblical, some that are all down to personal preference and like lifestyles, such as the Adonis and Aphrodite, where the couple is really focused, whether consciously or subconsciously, on just like being really in love with each other, and that's just kind of their thing. Is it's a very romantic, very erotic relationship. Then there's he has like the cookbook couple where one or both partners is really focused on the relationship, following a recipe almost like you need this at this time, you need this at this time, and he just brings a lot of things to the table to consider in a partner, just as far as someone you want to commit the rest of your life to spend the rest of your life with. This chapter I just think is really helpful, and it's one that you would want to go through if you are in a relationship. It's one that you would want to go through with your partner, and it would hopefully get you more on the same page as far as what you both want in marriage. I will say that, like with the last book, Outdated, JP sort of swung in one direction as far as like chemistry and compatibility being of no consequence, as at least in the initial stages of like looking for a romantic partner. He was all about character being the most important thing, or like the only important thing, at least in the beginning. But I think Thomas in this book swings in the other direction, perhaps a bit too far. Like the whole book is, like I said, things to consider, essentially like measuring compatibility with your partner or with a potential partner. And while I think that is important, I think it's dangerous also to think that you can be 100% compatible with anyone, or that once you find someone who is entirely compatible with you, that you guys will have just this perfect marriage. I think it maybe can set up for a dangerous expectation, because no marriage or relationship is going to be perfect. I think if you put too much weight on, compatibility as a factor in looking for a partner or in marrying someone, then that can be dangerous waters. But if you practice wisdom, if you acknowledge the fact that, this all comes with an asterisk next to it, which is that the person that you are going to marry one day is not perfect, this is a very solid book to read. Good book. Highly recommend it. Book number 4 that I read was Not Yet Married by Marshall Segal. Truth be told, I don't have much to say about this book. For all intents and purposes, it is a good book, but it was not a good book for me, I'll say. The title, Not Yet Married, implies the objective for this book, which is more addressing singleness, as opposed to like how to date. It more about how to be single and how to prepare for a dating relationship. And it does a good job in that. I would recommend it to someone who is looking to grow in relationship wisdom, how to be single better, how to date better, but also just for someone who's new to the Christian faith in general, because a lot of the chapters in this book, Segal, he'll give some form of advice in how to be single or how to date better, but the advice boils down to read your Bible, be in community, pray, all these things, which are super important things, and it's good advice. But for me, I was kind of underwhelmed reading your Bible and praying. To me, that was not new information, or was not groundbreaking information. But for someone who is new to the faith, very early on in their faith, they're looking for a book to bridge the gap between relationships and spiritual disciplines in general. This would be an excellent book for them. The only other thing I would say about this book is that Segal, he said it in here. He said he wrote 80 to 90% of the book while he was single. So he got married by the time the book was published, but he had written most of it while he was single. And for some people, that would be a good reason to read the book. I know, and I'm guilty of this too. Like, people who give advice on singleness, or be like, singleness is a gift. The people who say those things are usually people who are married or dating or something, and you're just kind of roll your eyes like, yeah, I don't really want to listen to you because you're not actually in my shoes right now. And the last 3 books, they're all about dating more than singleness, but they were all written by married men. So just for someone who's looking for more credibility as far as writing about singleness because they are single, that's the case with Not Yet Married. It was not the best book for me, and that's okay. But for someone who is newer to the faith, or someone who really is looking for that tie between more of the core disciplines of the faith and how those apply to relationships, this would be an excellent book for you. So that's kind of what I took away from Not Yet Married. And the last book I read was I Kissed Dating Goodbye by Joshua Harris. I picked this one a little bit more tongue-in-cheek. This book is sort of notorious, but I was curious to hear what it had to say. This book came out in 1997, so it's as old as me. I should caveat that anything I say about this book that's like negative has already been said by Joshua Harris. He rescinded the book from publication a few years ago. He made public statements apologizing. He made a documentary sort of about his journey through writing the book and the aftermath of it. So any sort of criticism I have were already made by the author and have been made by thousands of other people. But anyway, I'll say that probably 70% of this book is not bad, in my opinion. Harris, he wrote this when he was like 23 or 22, something like that, and he was single as well at the time of writing. I think there's a lot of wisdom in this, and I think that if you have discernment and the ability to really know what is biblical and what is more just personal preference, then you could take away some wisdom from this book. This book is not just an entire piece of propaganda or whatever. It really does contain good biblical information and perspectives that I think are valuable and that had value to the generation that really latched onto this book. But the book is problematic in some other areas. Well, it's problematic in some areas and then just kind of, in my opinion, irrelevant in others. I Kissed Dating Goodbye was one of the chief propagators of purity culture back in the 90s, early 2000s. Purity culture being just kind of an overemphasis on sexual purity, not living with the shame of having had sex or whatever before marriage. And so that movement, I think it was probably started with good intentions, but there was a much greater focus on a much more legalistic view of how you conduct yourself and how you use your body versus the grace of the gospel. Not that Harris doesn't acknowledge grace in his book, but compared to how much he talked about how the shame you would feel if you didn't save yourself for marriage would just be a chain that you would carry around with you for the rest of your life. That's just not a gospel-centered approach to sex or to relationships. So if you had any intentions of reading this book, I would just encourage you to be aware that although yes, it is noble and biblical to save yourself for marriage, that if you haven't, then grace is so much more powerful and should be so much more prominent in your life than shame and just guilt that you would feel because of that. As far as just the book coming down to some personal preference, the idea of kissing dating goodbye, the reason Harris kissed dating goodbye was because dating created too much of a temptation to have premarital sex, which I wouldn't argue with that too much because I think culturally that is a reality. But he replaces dating, his philosophy, he replaces it with courtship, which I just don't think I think it's kind of just dating with more steps. The second to last chapter in the book is where he breaks down his formula for advancing to marriage without dating. And the steps are, once you've found a person, the steps are casual friendship, deeper friendship, purposeful intimacy with integrity, and engagement. Casual friendship to deeper friendship. I agree with that. As I said in my dating apps video, my history just with my personal relationships is like, for me personally, I need to be a friend. I need to be friends with a girl before I can date her. Like, that's just how I develop trust and how I develop that connection. And I think probably for a lot of people, that's how it is. So I agree with that. But then his third step, purposeful intimacy with integrity. The way he explains it is two people, you and the other person, you both just pray and you talk to counsel about this other person, about like, oh, should I marry them? Could I spend the rest of my life with them? But you do that independent of each other. So you do that without actually acknowledging your feelings for the other person. Because if you prematurely acknowledge your feelings, then that could lead to intimacy, which would spiral into, things you don't want. And I just think that's a pretty big exaggeration of how that process usually works. At least for me, like, it could be different for other people, but he just makes it sound like any acknowledgement of feelings is a slippery slope to premarital sex, which I disagree with. And I just think that's poor communication. If you just are literally praying about, God, should I marry this person, but you have not spoken with that person about mutual attraction or just anything, that's just very poor communication, and that's not how relationships anywhere else develop. I just think it's backwards. And then that stage advances to the two of you do technically become sort of an item, but you still continue to not spend too much alone time together, and you have a lot of oversight from parents or like mentors in your life. And at that point, he doesn't call it dating, but it is dating. It's like you're dating with some added supervision, which is fine. There's an attempt to be edgy by like cutting out the word dating, but then you just kind of go right back to dating anyway. I don't know. I think it's kind of funny. Honestly, it's not something that I would do if it works. If it works for you, if it works for someone you know, or like that, those are the necessary steps you need to take in order to avoid sexual sin, then go for it. But, it's not for me. I will not be kissing dating goodbye anytime soon. As far as recommendations go, this would obviously be one that I would not recommend. Like I said, there is good in it, but with the knowledge that there are better books out there, I would just say skip this one. Also, the author straight up doesn't want people reading it anymore. So, the author doesn't want anyone to read it anymore, but he also isn't a Christian anymore, and he got a divorce from his wife. So, that's too bad. Anyway, I Kissed Dating Goodbye. There's better stuff out there. That's it. 5 books on Christian dating and singleness. I learned a lot. Hopefully you learned something too. I really hope that one of the 4 books that I recommended, I hope one of them stood out to you and that you pick it up, because you will be wiser and better prepared for a godly marriage by reading it, or by reading one or all of them. Let me know if you've read any of them, or if I missed a book, if I should do this again with 5 different books. I love to read, so I'm all ears as far as suggestions go. If you enjoy this video, if it helps you out in some way, please give the video a like. That would be bueno. And subscribe, because I would appreciate that as well. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. I appreciate you all very much, and I will see you in the next one.